the daughters of Latin America live everywhere on the four corners of this world. But what I want people to understand is that understanding the world, the Latin America, specifically through the lens of its women, is to fully understand Latin America, is to fully and deeply understand Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Heyman Marrero from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of I Have Something to Say. And I've been waiting for months for this day, for this week, for the launch of Daughters of Latin America. Yay! And to have my dear friend, award-winning author, filmmaker, producer, documentarist, the great journalist, writer, my priestess, Sandra Guzman, to talk to us about this amazing piece of literature that we've been longing for in the Latino community and really here in the US mainstream market and internationally forever. And welcome, Sandra. To have this conversation with me today is a gift.
Hi, Sami. It's so wonderful to be here with you. I just, I see you and you make you light my heart.
Same here. And I can't tell you how excited I was to get my two copies because I bought one for me and for Catalina, who's an avid reader, of Dola, who we affectionately call Daughters of Latin America Dola, because I've been privy, right, to the deliciousness, right, of the development of this anthology for months, for well, more than months, for a couple of years now, but really coming to this last, this last run, these past few months have been very intense. And so I wanted to have an opportunity to have this conversation about you, about how it originated, what was it inspired by, right? The development and all of those layers that really are embedded in the creation of this book that really serves to empower, to uplift, to elevate the voices of Latina women internationally, and then also to inform and educate about these voices that have been, many of them, right, invisible to most.
So there's a couple of questions. The first one is, this anthology is a sister anthology to New Daughters of Africa, and it was edited by Margaret Busby, and it was published about 4 years ago, and edited by the amazing editor Tracy Sherrod, who used to be the head of Amistad, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. It's the African American and now multicultural imprint of HarperCollins. And Tracy edited this magnificent, almost 1,000 page anthology of Daughters of Africa at the international level. And the book was edited by Margaret Busby. And so the birth of this book began when Tracy sent a copy to an agent, Leticia, in Texas. And Leticia is just flipping through it and seeing the magnificence of this anthology. And she says, "Well, I would love one for Latinas." And Tracy says, "Well, let's do it, propose it." And so that's kind of like how it was born. I came in at the very stage when they were looking for an anthologist. And so it fell on my lap in the middle of the pandemic. And I have to say that earlier, like I would say like 2 weeks before the project fell on my lap, my husband gave me a copy of New Daughters of Africa. And I was reading it at night. I have a ritual every night. I make myself a cup of fresh tea. And I would just pick up this book because anthologies are magical. They are magical because you can pick them up at whatever page, just open them, and they have a gift waiting for you. I was reading it the traditional way. I read the intro, I understood what Margaret, the intentionality of the editor, and I was absolutely enthralled with the book. And so when a couple of weeks later, I received this phone call, "Would you like to edit Daughters of Latin America?" I was flipping out of joy. Could you imagine?
No, I can't.
So that's how it began. In the
That's
middle of the
awesome.
pandemic, I was given this gift. Yes.
That's fantastic. And I know that we've had this conversation. I've heard you say that, I mean, you've worked on a lot of projects, right? And some like really big, meaningful, um, yeah, works of art, right? In different forms, multimedia and all of that. I know that you were the interviewer in one of the producers of The Pieces I Am with the great late Toni Morrison, which I know is like your muse and your mentor. And so to go from that to then now have just another fantastic opportunity. I just keep on glancing at the book because it's so beautiful, right?
Oh, so
This must be like just you must be in awe, right? Of how you're attracting all of these wonderful opportunities to really create and to really have that freedom of forming, right? This content following really your heart and obviously imparting all of that intelligence and all of that historical knowledge that you have because you've been at this for a hot minute, ¿verdad? And so how does it feel and how do you sense that this is part of the body of your work?
Oh, what a great question. So after working with Toni Morrison, after we did this beautiful thing together, which is the art of the interview is something that is so special because you can ask the wrong question and the interview is over. You can ask the right question in the right way and portals open up.
Mm.
And that's what happened with Toni. She was my companion for, I would say, 2 years when I moved up north to be with my husband, where he was teaching at a private school in New Hampshire, and I was very lonely. I was the only one of my kind, the only Puerto Rican Afro-Indigenous woman in this very um, white state. And every time I would step out the door, I would cause a ruckus, like, "Where are you from?" Because of the way I look, because of the way I sound. I guess I don't sound like and I don't look like somebody who could be from the North to people who are from the North. And so, anyway, it felt like a very lonely experience. And I began to read Toni in that as a companion, like out of curiosity. I began to read her from beginning to end. So, from her first novel to her last novel. And at the end of this experience, I wanted to know who this woman was. I wanted to know more about her. And I love documentaries. And so what I did was I started researching documentaries, and then I realized, oh my goodness, there's no documentary about her. And she
Mm.
famously said to writers, if there's a book you want to read that has not been written, then write it. And so that was my call to arms. And so I did this beautiful work with her. It was amazing, and I'm so proud of it. And in many ways, Toni led me back to my ancestral roots, reading
Mm.
her and reading about Black Southern, specifically Southern African Americans. I just went back to my roots in Southern Boriquen, in Southern Puerto Rico. We had a lot of similar histories, right? Because my father was a Black man who worked the cane. I have ancestors who are survivors of slavery. I have a great grandmother who ran away from a plantation to freedom, and my mother is indigenous, and so there were so many ways in which our histories crossed, and so reading her was almost like reading my story as well, and it took me back home. And so this is a natural expression of the next thing that I was to do, except I didn't know that I was to do this. And what I want to say is that all of my projects have been, I say they're like gifts from heaven, from the ancestors. I have never been one to say, and this is what I want to do in 5 years. I am guided
Mm.
by what I need to be doing at the present moment. And I enjoy
Mm.
the present moment with a lot more and more as I get older, with a lot of gusto, with a lot of, ganas. And so this project comes along to show me that I have yet to learn so much about the brilliance that exists in my tradition and in the traditions of Latin America and the Caribbean, which this is just the tip of the iceberg, this anthology.
I can imagine. I can imagine. And as I understand it, Amistad HarperCollins, right? Also, I mean, what were the parameters to produce, right, or to create this book?
I love that question because so once the contract was signed, I called Tracy, who's now at Little Brown, Tracy Sherrod. I said, so Tracy, what are you thinking? What do you think about this anthology? She says, I don't know. It's your anthology. You do what you want. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? That answer gave me wings. It gave me wings to dream. It gave me wings to be magnanimous in the approach to curating this work. And it also terrified me. I mean, come on, the pressure was on. Can I deliver, So that's how it began. And to begin the work, I made a list of my favorite writers that had to be in this anthology. And then I also started calling friends, and it was really interesting. The first person I spoke to was a young Colombian sister, and I did not know her. But I started doing research. So you must understand, I am the daughter of Lidia Gonzalez Santos Roman. I am the granddaughter of Angelica and Emiliana, and the great granddaughter of Lucila and Mama Heca Ramona, who was a Taína indigenous leader, matriarch of her community. So I want to honor them in everything I do. And because I am their daughter, and because I am also the daughter of African people who survived slavery in colonial times in Puerto Rico, my first instinct was to make sure that I included indigenous women in this anthology and African Latinas in this anthology, because we know that Latino America is the most diverse region, I think, in the world. We're very multilingual, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious. And so it was very important for me to lift the voices of these women that I know throughout history have been marginalized. And
Mm.
so the first phone call I make is to this woman who I heard an interview with, and I said, I must talk to her. And she's a young Colombian feminist, and she pointed me to an indigenous woman named Betty Cha, who was the first indigenous woman to publish a memoir out of Colombia, and she's from the Uwa nation of Colombia. It's around Bogota, which is what Bogota uh, turned into Bogota. So she writes a memoir about what it was like in the 1940s. So it wasn't too long ago when Spaniards came in and Jesuits came in to colonize their community and what happened to her community. And what was gut wrenching about this memoir was that she said, and the memoir is called Tengo los pies en la cabeza. I have my feet on top of my head. And what this memoir captures is the demise of her people. And she said in her memoir, I needed to write the stories of my people so that one day you would know that we existed. And so
Mm.
that was, I still get goosebumps when I
Wow.
see this
Wow.
because this is what the women have taught me. We write and we write and we write. So there has been evidence. We testify to our experience throughout the ages.
Wow, that's very, very powerful. And so wow. And so these writers somehow know each other because it's like this 6 degrees of separation, not even, right? It's like, so then you speak to one, and that's how you started weaving this collection of 140 voices that represent so many intersectionalities within the Latino community, and this concept, right, of what Latino America is. And so
Mhm.
then how did you go about, right, determining what stays, what doesn't, how many are you got, and also the types of writings that would be included?
So these are all really great questions. Let's unpack this. We're talking about a post colonial anthology. And what that means is that the way that we define Latin America to the mainstream people audience is countries that speak Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that definition of Latin America was an imperialist definition because we're much more than countries that speak Spanish. I have a deep connection to the Caribbean. I'm a Caribbean born woman. And so someone like Edwidge Danticat or Maris Condé or Jamaica Kincaid or Nancy Morejon, and these are women from Cuba, from Guadeloupe, from Haiti. They have been very meaningful in my life. And Marise writes in French, and Edwige writes in English. He's a Haitian immigrant that now is living in the United States. And so, for me, the definition of Latin America as an only Spanish speaking as only Spanish speaking territories have always felt just like very wrong.
Mm.
And you come to learn, right, that Latin America is also Brazil. Latin America is also the Guyanas. Latin America is also, it's from Mexico to the Caribbean to Patagonia. And
Okay.
so I wanted to make sure that I had all of these different expressions. And then I heard a statistic that gutted me. It just broke me into pieces. And that statistic is that every 14 days, an indigenous language dies around the world. And so I began to think, what happens when a language dies? It's the death of a culture, it's a death of connection to the land and to the cosmos, right? It's devastating. And I started to learn that in Mexico alone, you can speak a different language every day of the year, 365 days of the year. And not one of those days will you speak Spanish or English or French or Dutch or any of the other languages that have colonized the world. We're talking about ancient dialects and mother tongues. And that opened up a whole new world for me. So I started reaching out to Zapotecas, I started reaching out to Mixes, I started reaching out to the indigenous women of Mexico, and you learn that, oh my goodness, there's a renaissance that's happening there. And so that that thing that you mentioned, that one thing leads to the other, I would reach out to one writer, and then the one writer would say, but do you know about this other writer? So Carolina de Robertis, for instance, is a Uruguayan poet and novelist, and essayist out of California, who's queer, and she's written really beautiful novels. One of them is called Cantoras. I reach out to her and I ask her, would she want to participate? And she says yes. And she says, do you know about Virginia Brindis de Salas? And she's the first Afro Uruguaya, the first African woman, a poet, to have been published in South America. And so then I go on that path and I start to read and figure out how to reach the ancestor heirs, because this is anthologies are tricky, right? So if you anthologize an ancestor, you have to make sure you have permission from the heirs, from the estate.
Mm,
And sometimes the estates are in pristine order, and sometimes the estates are in terrible disorder. And so I was very lucky to have, oh my goodness, to have spoken to Virginia Brindis de Sales's daughter,
mm,
who was just so excited that her mother was going to be in this anthology. And then who connected me um, to Cantora, to Carolina de Robertis? Dalma Llanos Figueroa, a Boricua, Afro Boricua writer who wrote this beautiful book called Daughters of the Stone. And it's a trilogy. She's written now 2 novels. And so this is how anthologies are. They're something that you do alone, right? In the company of yourself, but you're also doing it in community. And I will be remiss not to mention the role of the translators in this anthology. We're talking about 24 languages, right? There's English and Spanish, Portuguese, French. Then there are all the indigenous tongues that are in this language. And we needed translators to translate into the English language all of these works. So the role of the translator in this anthology was also fundamental.
wow, that's incredible. And when we're talking about some of the indigenous representation, we're talking about chants and prayers, and I mean all kinds of forms of writings and words, right?
Yeah,
Verbal
this is
expressions.
yes, this is a multi-genre anthology. There's chants, prayers, songs, essays, opinion, memoirs in progress, novels in progress, plays. There are letters. I love letters. I love the intimacy that letters bring to literature. There's also speeches. So I want to share that there's a letter. One of my favorite pieces, they're all my favorite in many different ways. There's lyrical essays, there's personal essays. Um, One of my favorite pieces, and they're all my favorite, is a letter that Julia de Burgos, Julia, the great poet of Puerto Rico, Boriquen, she wrote to her sister in the 1940s or 50s, and she was living in Cuba, and she wrote a letter to her sister, Consuelo, and she's telling her, you have to come to Cuba. You have to take advantage of school here. It's cheaper. It's magnificent. She says, and guess what? She says, guess who came to visit me the other week? Pablo Neruda. And guess what? I made an asopao for him. And he fell in love with my work, and he told me I must keep writing and that he's going to be my mentor. And then she says, and by the way, I want to be a lawyer. Let's be lawyers together and let's open a law firm together. And so when I read this letter, I was in love with the intimacy between sisters, right?
Yeah.
We get to see the poet in a different light. The other letter that I have is of another poet, Gabriela Mistral. She is the Chilena great poet, and she's the only Latin American woman to have won a Nobel Prize in Literature.
Mm,
Actually, Maricé Condé won the Nobel Prize in 2018, but that was the year that the Nobel Prize was canceled because of some scandalous sexual harassment. That this is during the Me Too. But
mhm.
Gabriela Mistral was gossiped about as this like spinster who was angry, who, you know, she never got married or had kids. And that was sort of like her persona. But then you read the letters and you're like, she's having a good time. She was in the closet, she was gay, and she had all these lovers. So and then she's like writing about Connie, who she met in Vermont, and then she followed her to Vermont. And I mean, she followed her from Vermont to Puerto Rico, and that's why she ended up teaching at La Universidad de Puerto Rico because she was following a lover. And I'm like, oh my God, the public persona was so different than the private person. And then I chose a beautiful letter, a love letter that she writes to her loved one, Doris Dana. She's writing to her from Italy. She's writing the Book of Chile, which is her epic poetry collection, Poems of Chile, I believe it's called. And she says, "Mi amor, you know, I miss you so much. La gatita misses you too." So so letters are really sweet and powerful and intimate, and I wanted to include letters. There's also speeches. I am excited to share that the speech that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez delivered on the congressional floor after she was called a bitch, um, for me is one of the most powerful modern contemporary speeches. And I feel that it should be studied. And I certainly feel that it's literature. And
Mhm.
so I included that speech as well. So it's what's beautiful about this anthology, and what was fun curating it were the different kinds of writings and the different styles and the different traditions. You know, you have many of the indigenous women who are writing ancient stories. They're
Yeah.
Some of them are based on spirit. You know, some of them are based on stories that were told to them by their abuelas and abuelos. So you have a mixture. You have essays. There are political essays. I love Laura Segato's. She delivered a speech in 2019 in Argentina, and she takes on the entire publishing industry. And she's one of the foremost feminist intellectuals in Latin America today. So it just gave me such pleasure to include women who are doing great work, but also Sami, it gave me great pleasure to include women who have been ignored by
Mhm.
the publishing industry. So when you think about,
Mhm.
when you read about like the Latin American boom, that
Yeah.
includes Julio Cortázar, that includes Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you rarely see a woman mentioned
Yeah.
in the.
Mhm.
So for me, it was important to include the Argentinian Sara Gallardo, who was a mystical realist, and she's no longer with us; she's an ancestor. But to also include Alba Lucia Angel, who is a Colombian, who is an exquisite writer, and who has not gotten the flowers that she deserves. And so it was really important for me to also go through history and recognize and lift the women who have not been recognized alongside their male peers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And there's so many. There's so many. Yeah, it's incredible, and I just feel that this is a very timely anthology being published here on the US mainland, right? When there's so much growth, well, there's always been growth in the Latino population, but that now, right, we're reaching that tipping point in terms of the demographics. And I feel, and I've shared this with you, this is my personal feeling, that this book will serve to bring us out of our invisibility, especially with the big plans that we have and that are already taking place, right? I mean, so what is your vision for the book?
You know, at the beginning of this book, I reached out to one of my mentors, one of my literary mentors, somebody whom I respect profoundly. I love her work. Her work has been instrumental in my development, and her name is Esmeralda Santiago, Puerto Rican novelist, memoirist, also an anthologist, essayist. And she makes her poetry debut in the book, and I'm so excited. And when I reached out to her, she was one of the first people, if not the first author that I spoke to. And I told her about the project. She said to me, "I will participate if you promise to make sure that you bring young voices into the fold."
Wow. Oh,
And
wow.
I was like, absolutely. She was interested in learning some new things, not just the typical. And, you know, we got to give credit. I do have the very beloved and famous writers, you know, Sandra Cisneros and Ana Castillo and Elena Maria Viramontes and Julia Alvarez. And these are women who are just have paved the way for us, right? But what Esmeralda was telling me that we also have to bring the young daughters in. And so
Mm.
in this anthology, there's the youngest woman is 27 and the oldest is 92, Elena Poniatowska out of Mexico. And what do I want for this anthology to do? I want this anthology to touch hearts, to illuminate. I want this anthology to be studied in schools. I want families to read poems like you did or essays and talk about them. This anthology is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the brilliance that exists within the Latina women experience. And I could not get enough women in this book as many. I mean, I could fit 140 into 500 pages. And the work continues. The work continues. This is a taste of our brilliance. I want this book to transform the way that we're looked at, because the truth is that when you look at Latin America and Latina women, right, when you look at this world through the lens of women, when you look at any region, but now we're talking about Latin America and the Caribbean and us in the United States and wherever we are, because we are in the four corners of the world. There are contributors who are Latinas who have moved to Africa, to Luanda, who have
Mhm.
moved to Barcelona, who have moved to Germany, who have moved to different parts of the world, because we know that climate change, fascist regimes, economies collapsing, we know that that drives immigration. So the daughters of Latin America live everywhere on the four corners of this world. But what I want people to understand is that understanding the world, the Latin America, specifically through the lens of its women, is to fully understand Latin America, is to fully and deeply understand Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's one of my wishes.
Yes, and I think so, and even for the younger generations, when I received my copy this week, because it just came out, and I had pre-ordered two books, one for myself and one for Catalina. Catalina turns 14 in next month, and so it was so amazing to open the book and just, you know, receive what Dola gave me, right? And I bump into the poem "Not Now" by Idea Vilariño, the Uruguayan essayist and a literary critic. And it
Poet.
was, yes, and poet. It was a poem, and it was so powerful. It kind of like just like almost knocked me off my chair, right? And then I had to say it verbally because I just read it. And then I said, wait a second, wait, what just happened? And so then I read it. And then when Catalina came home from school, she admired the book because she's an avid reader. And I told her, Mama, I have a copy for you. And I told her, you have to read this poem. and it was relatable, right? Like she's 14, she's gonna be 14, I'm 53. But then we had this whole conversation about the poem, and it really spoke to her, made her feel good too, because it's like fire, you know?
Yeah.
And it made me so happy that she felt proud, right? To know that these are the words of someone, right, that represents her heritage, that represents her voice, that was pushing boundaries, because it's very, very powerful, right? And she stepped into that power by just reading it with me and then having this conversation. Anyway, it was just amazing, and I want to thank you for doing such a beautiful job in curating and editing and really getting to know these writers, right? The ancestors and the ones that are still with us. Because I feel that you're giving us an intimate look into, right, the Latina experience, and of how we feel and how we move and how we operate and how we um defy, right? And all of these, and how we love and how we cry, and all of the emotions
Well,
in
yeah,
a
there's
very
there's there's erotica here. There's I love that there's sexiness in this book. I have
yeah.
Maria Hinojosa, who's a journalist, who's always she's just an incredible award-winning, powerful journalist, doing the beautiful work of telling our Latino stories across America and into Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean. And she writes an erotica fiction story, so she's like stretching her gift. There's also Anais Nin, who was a Cuban French diarist, and she's famous for having kept a diary since she was 9 years old until the day that she died in her 70s
Oh,
or into.
wow.
And so I pulled from one of her diaries, and so there's joy in this anthology, but
Mhm.
all of the women. So the base of this anthology, if I were the connective tissue is the land, right? The beautiful lands where we come from, the motherlands that we are connected to by an umbilical cord, right? Even if we're not there, or we're far away, or we're there, we're always interconnected to the land. So that's the interconnected tissue that binds us. But also, what binds us is that none of these women are writing through the master gaze. They're free of the master gaze. They're free women. They're. This is in the spirit. This anthology is in the spirit of the matriarchy. This anthology celebrates the matriarchy. You know, I was raised in a small community of indigenous women and men,
Mhm.
and Afro Boricuas, and it was the women who led and lead these families. And so, because I was raised in the matriarchy, I understand the power of the matriarchy, and I realize that I am not alone. There's all of these matriarchs throughout the Caribbean and Latin America that have been writing for centuries and celebrating this way of looking at the world. And so, um, and I love that Catalina was connected to this poem, because that's what I want. You know, this is an intergenerational collection. You have a 21st century writer next to an 18th century thinker. You have, the oldest text here was written in 1691
Wow.
by Sor Juana de la Cruz, right? The great nun who basically went into the nunnery because that was the only way that she could learn to read or write and have an intellectual life.
Mm.
And also, there's a woman that begins the anthology, and her name is Maria Sabina. She's known in the world as the Mushroom Priestess. But what people don't also know about Maria Sabina is that she was one of the greatest 20th century poets in Latin America. And the reason why people don't know about her as a poet is because she did not she did not read or write in Spanish, nor did she read or write in her native tongue, which is Mazatec. She's a Mazateca from Huautla, Oaxaca. And when you hear her chants, you are transported to a different dimension.
Mm.
So she's sort of the Homer. You know how Homer was illiterate, but then,
Mm-hmm.
wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey? And so
Yeah.
he lauded as a great literary star. Well, we have our own Homer, and her name is Maria Sabina. And she is someone that begins the anthology because her chant opens up the portals to the anthology.
Oh,
So there's a lot in this anthology, and I'm really grateful to have given the honor to do the work, because I am a storyteller, and I come from a long line of storytellers, and to be given this opportunity to pull together the great storytellers of our time and in the past and in the future is an absolute and exquisite honor that I'm still just reveling in.
I'm so happy for you, Sandra, and I'm so thankful for you taking time to have this meaningful, deep conversations. Just a profound moment, that I feel it's like the start of something really, really huge. And I'm just blessed and honored to call you hermana.
Ah, me too, me too, me too, sister, hermana.
Te amo.
Yo también, gracias. The word bomatum in Taino means sacred thanks, sacred thank you. So
Bomatum.
bomatum,
Bomatum.
Sami.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Heyman Marrero from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU.